Alors bonjour, avec nous maintenant Megan Leslie, députée d'Halifax, et François Choquette, député de Drummond, du NPD. Ils vont réagir au rapport annuel du commissaire à l'environnement.
Merci. Hello, and thank you all for being here. I would first like to extend my thanks to Interim Commissioner Maxwell for this excellent report. As we all well know, the work of the Office of the Environment Commissioner is essential to government accountability, and this report helps us better understand the problems in management and lack of action on a file that's so important to human health, as well a file that underpins our economy. The theme of this report is consistent mismanagement and lack of accountability by the government in protecting our ecosystems, our habitats, and our species at risk. It extends to the government's Sustainable Development Strategy, which is supposed to be a guiding document for how we green government actions. The Commissioner found a pattern of unfulfilled commitments and responsibilities, none of which really comes as a surprise because that is this government's MO. They are unwilling or unable to get the job done. The Conservative legacy may well be the loss of species and habitat that we rely upon and that we cherish. After reading this report, we're left shaking our heads. How can the government ask for the confidence of Canadians when they aren't holding themselves up to a standard, or if they aren't sufficiently monitoring or reporting on progress? Canadians are being left in the dark on this file. The Commissioner's report shows total mismanagement. However, in combination with actions like muzzling scientists, one can't help but wonder if the actions are intentional. We know the Conservatives, they've given up on issues like fighting climate change. But when it comes to parks or protected areas, these are issues that the Conservatives purport to care about. Now, we've all read this audit, and is this what you do with a file that you actually care about? Is this what you do? You hand over money without knowing where it's going? You fail to have management plans, or you create a pattern of unfulfilled commitments and responsibilities? The Conservatives are failing on this file, and they are failing spectacularly. The report notes that budget cuts have had an impact, and I would say that means that the Conservatives have actually brought this upon themselves. So, what are we asking for? Well, the NDP is calling on the government to do the following: that the government implements the Commissioner's recommendations, including urgent action on recovery strategies for species and areas at risk. There can be no more broken promises. We have tabled a motion asking the Commissioner to testify at committee about his findings and recommendations, and we hope that the government will vote in favour of that motion. We are also calling for the resumption of the Species at Risk statutory review and a further review to understand the impacts of changes to the environmental assessment legislation and those changes on species at risk. And finally, I would note that the NDP is the only party to have advanced legislation to ensure that all new federal laws and policies are examined through that sustainability lens to ensure they're consistent with the principles of sustainable development. Merci.
Bonjour à tous. Le rapport du commissaire de l'environnement d'aujourd'hui lance un véritable cri d'alarme quant à la nécessité d'agir rapidement pour protéger la biodiversité du Canada. Le rapport est clair. Sous le gouvernement conservateur, les espèces les plus à risque sont laissées de côté et connaissent une diminution considérable, malgré le fait que cela avait été identifié comme leur priorité. De plus, les habitats menacés de la flore et de la faune ne sont pas adéquatement identifiés et protégés. Les conservateurs ignorent le problème et ne remédient pas à la situation. On sait que les conservateurs ont abandonné l'idée de s'attaquer au changement climatique. Mais avec ce rapport, on voit qu'ils ont géré d'une façon incompétente la protection de la biodiversité et des espèces en danger. Afin de remédier à la situation, les conservateurs coupent dans les budgets d'Environnement Canada et au lieu de remédier à la situation, les conservateurs coupent dans les budgets d'Environnement Canada et font des promesses qu'ils ne peuvent pas tenir, comme les objectifs de la Convention sur la diversité biologique des Nations unies. Il faut comprendre que la viabilité de notre économie est intimement liée à la protection de notre environnement et de la biodiversité. Ce que nous voulons, c'est que le gouvernement agisse maintenant et qu'il mette en œuvre les recommandations du commissaire. Il est urgent d'avoir un plan d'action et d'avoir des stratégies pour protéger les aires et les espèces menacées. Merci de votre attention et nous sommes prêts à prendre vos questions.
Première question, Bruce Chill, the Canadian Press.
Hi, Ms. Leslie. I'd like to expand on the parks question, because that is something the government has. They've created new national parks. I know Mr. Kent, that's when he left the portfolio, that was something he was proud of. What does it say to you that on even something as well-defined as national parks, they seem to be falling short on monitoring?
The parks file, it's really troubling because, as you point out, they are congratulating themselves about what they've done on parks. And I've worked with government to try, for example, with Sable Island National Park. I was proud to work on that file to create those boundaries. But then the question comes, what's next if they're not being managed properly? 90% of wildlife areas are they're working on out-of-date management plans. What we're seeing is lack of management of what's there. I can't remember if it was in the Environment Commissioner's press release or in the report or his spoken comments, but he has said that it does come down to management. He's talked about innovative ways to go forward. He's talked about some successes where the management has been good, but it's not being implemented across the board. So it's hard for me to accept that parks is a strong file for government when this report shows that they're not taking action where they need to be.
Can I just ask you to respond? The minister's release on this report fails to acknowledge that there are any criticisms, essentially. It's quite a long response from the minister's office, and it does not acknowledge that there are any issues anywhere. And so, in fact, seems to characterize these audits as endorsing the government's policies. Can you speak to that?
Well, government will say what it needs to say to make itself feel better about the work that it's not doing. We do have the Environment Commissioner coming to committee on Thursday. I fully expect that the questions will be along those lines as well. The questions will be, tell us about what a fantastic job we're doing on X and Y. I believe that they'll completely avoid the fact that there are real criticisms in here. This role of the Environment Commissioner, it's in the Auditor General's office. These are audits, right? These aren't political statements. These aren't policy statements. It's an audit of whether or not a government is achieving the goals that it set out for itself. And I would think that any smart government that believes in good management, that they would take those recommendations for what they are, which is an extremely valuable point of view. It's an audit, but you know, I think the Conservatives are they're pretty delusional on the environment file, and they'll pull the one line that says, yes, there are trees in this park, and say, see what a success we protected trees, but they're not looking at what the rest of the report says.
Margot McDermott, CBC News.
Well, what are the possibilities then, if we have what you call a delusional government on the environment file, of anything happening? Because I've read many Environment Commissioners' reports where Environment Canada or the department they're talking about says, yes, we agree with you, but then 2 years or 4 years later, there's still problems. So what are the chances of anything changing?
Well, I think you've touched on something really important, because the Commissioner does talk about this pattern. Right, there's a pattern of failure. It doesn't have to be that way, because he does talk about some successes where government has been proactive and has taken on a leadership role, especially in working with partners, other levels of government or community stakeholders. And so it can work. Right? It's not, we don't just throw up our hands and say, oh gosh, we're never going to be able to work on this. Not at all. When we see those best practices, we should be seizing on them and sharing them across the board. But the reality is there aren't adequate management plans. It's sort of, you know, it's like, well, we're going to give money to Nature Conservancy. They could be doing good work, but we don't know. There's no follow-up. There's no accountability. But we're not talking about an insurmountable project here. We're talking about sound management practices. It's absolutely possible.
Juste pour ajouter à ce point, ça fait 2 ans au Comité de l'environnement qu'on reçoit des témoins qui nous disent la loi sur les espèces en péril est bonne, mais elle doit être appliquée correctement. Le problème, c'est de l'application. Et ça fait 2 ans que les témoins le disent aux conservateurs, ça fait 2 ans qu'ils se tournent les pouces. Alors, effectivement, il y a des choses qu'on peut faire concrètement pour améliorer la situation. On a parlé des belugas, on a parlé de la sauvagine. Donc, effectivement, il faut agir correctement.
Oui.
Follow-up, Margot. Mike D'Souza, Post Media.
Hi. The report makes some observations about the work of committees. You've mentioned that the commissioner is being invited to the Environment Committee. I don't know if you reviewed those comments within the report, but what do you think of the role that Parliament is now playing? Do other committees have a role to look at these reports and address some of the issues? And do you see Parliament playing a different role in the future to address some of these issues?
I think I'm pleased that the Environment Commissioner raised this, and I think it's a good reminder for us all to stay engaged with the office, even if it's the most recent report that we've been working on at Environment Committee has been terrestrial conservation, and it's a good reminder from the Environment Commissioner's office to say, hey, invite us to committee. We have expertise on this. There is a problem with the committee structure where government has imagined it in silos. So, for example, the Natural Resources Committee, if they want to take on a piece of how their work overlaps with environment and species at risk, they're told by the chair, no, that's not in our mandate. We've had that problem at Environment Committee, too, where we want to talk about fish habitat. Nope, that's fisheries. Well, it's also environment, right? And so I don't feel that other committees are tapping into the Environment Commissioner as much as they could. And I also feel if they tried, they would be shut down. I hope that Environment Committee takes advantage of the Environment Commissioner more frequently and brings the office in as much as possible because it's relevant to all the work we're doing at committee.
Can they use the reports also to bring in government officials more often to get them to answer specific questions raised?
Oh, for sure. And I think we can also use the reports to think about what should we be studying. So, for example, the NDP has repeatedly called for a continuation of the legislated review of SARA, Species at Risk Act. It's pointed out in this report that we're not meeting our goals. So why aren't we actually tackling that at committee? With all due respect to conservation, this is our third conservation study in 2 years. We've done urban conservation, we've done conservation, we're now doing terrestrial conservation. Meanwhile, we haven't completed a legislative review on species at risk. There's a majority of Conservatives on the committee. We're pushing for it. But they're blocking it. They're stopping it from happening.
Carl Nuremberg, Rebel.ca.
Hi, thank you. Just briefly explain how is it possible. Let me just preface, we talked about the Environment Committee. I do remember the previous minister appearing with the deputy talking about many issues. They talked about many issues that aren't covered by this report, such as climate change. But the Species at Risk Act came up, and the protection plans in particular, and that issue was raised for the small number of species for which there would, I don't know if there was an actual figure, if it was the same figure, but how is it possible to have 500 and some species at risk identified and only 7 action plans? What happened? Like how, is it just bureaucratic problem?
Yeah.
Why does that happen?
You know, I heard the Environment Commissioner sort of give a perspective about management, right, and trying to be innovative to solve these problems. I'm going to give a different perspective. I think this is absolutely a failure of political will on the part of the Conservatives. Look at the fact that with the sage grouse in Alberta and Saskatchewan, I mean, we can count practically on 2 hands how many are left. And sure, they issued an emergency protection order recently for the sage grouse, because they were brought to court by an environmental organization that said, you must act, you are failing to act. It was the courts that pushed them to actually issue this emergency protection order. And then what did we see the next day? We saw a celebratory press release from the Conservatives patting themselves on the back for the bold action they took on sage grouse. So I would... The Environment Commissioner has a very particular role to play in doing an audit, and like I said earlier, it's not a political role. I think the political piece is government is failing to act on this. It's a lack of political will. They don't want to act when it comes to species at risk specifically. On the other pieces like parks or protected lands, I would put that more in the management camp. But on the species at risk, that they just don't want to touch that file.
J'ajouterais juste que aussi il y a une mauvaise gestion quand ce qui concerne la science. On coupe dans la science, par exemple, en ce qui concerne les belugas dans le fleuve Saint-Laurent. On en a parlé. Moi, j'ai posé des questions à la Chambre des communes sur ce sujet. On a coupé la science éco-toxicologique. On a coupé la science halieutique à l'Institut Maurice Lamontagne. Alors, ce sont tous des aspects où, après, c'est difficile d'appliquer la loi sur les espèces en péril, étant donné que la capacité scientifique de savoir comment remédier à la situation n'existe plus. Alors, c'est pour ça que le NPD mentionne qu'il est toujours très important d'avoir la science, de se fier à la science pour prendre des bonnes décisions.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Last one?
Oh,
So
I don't get to say yes.
There was a question that I tried to get the commissioner to talk about, and then he said, well, I talk about how well the government is fulfilling the role that is all in the legislation that exists and for which there are regulations. But because there's been a huge legislative shift, there's all kinds of legislative changes. So I evoke the changes to Fisheries Act and navigable waters and the potential impact on species that may or may not be at risk now, may be at risk in the future. But how do you see that? I mean, how do we get an evaluation of the go-forward environmental impact of changing legislation if that's not the role of the Environment Commissioner?
Well, it could be the role of the Environment Commissioner, just not in this report. So the NDP has actually tabled a motion asking that we do a study first at committee to look at, well, what will be the impacts. I do think that, let me think. I'm pretty sure in one of the issues that's on the table for the Environment Commissioner for future reports is the impact of those changes to the Environmental Assessment Act and Fisheries Act. I don't know if it's confirmed, but I know the office has been talking about, well, we need to do an audit of this. The one, the elephant in the room maybe is the fact that these changes around species, or not changes, the failure on species at risk, you can directly link many of these cases to oil and gas. Right? Look at the species that we're talking about, sage grouse, caribou, right? That's exactly the habitat that needs to be protected where we have oil and gas exploration and exploitation. And the decisions, because it is a decision not to act, the decision not to act by government is absolutely in keeping with what they want to do to support exclusively one industry and one aspect of our economy.
Is there any other question? Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.